This week's episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by the Collaborative for Student Success. EWA retains full editorial control over the content of this podcast.
This is EWA Radio, the podcast of the Education Writers Association. I'm public editor and your host, Kavitha Cardoza. I'm very excited to welcome two of the best beat reporters in the country, literally. Mila Koumpilova is senior reporter for Chalkbeat Chicago. At the recent EWA National Seminar, she won Best Beat Reporting in the Mid-Size Newsroom category. And John Marcus, who is editor and reporter for the Hechinger Report, was a finalist in the Small Newsroom category. Thank you both for joining me my very first time hosting this podcast.
It's an honor.
It's great to be here, Kavitha. Thanks for having us.
So let's jump right into ideas. What are 5 to 6 back-to-school story ideas on your list, and why are they important? Mila, would you like to start?
Sure. I feel like this fall is very much the start of this Recovery 2.0 school year for districts across the country. We saw last year that COVID surges, staffing shortages, just this heavy lift of learning how to do school together again in a school building really hampered what was supposed to be a recovery year, both in terms of academics and mental health. So it didn't happen. Now districts will be trying it again. I'll be really keeping a close eye on what are some of the strategies. How are we tracking what's working? How are districts learning from last year and from each other? And then another big issue that I think a lot of us on the K-12 education beat will be watching is enrollment, especially in urban districts such as Chicago, where enrollment was already on the decline before COVID hit. We saw those losses really accelerate. And so especially at the pre-kindergarten and kindergarten level, we'll be really watching closely to see whether enrollment will bounce back as we're starting to reclaim more of a sense of normalcy. We also know that a lot of high school students disengaged during the pandemic. And so I think it's important to continue asking what are districts doing to bring them back and re-engage them?
Mm-hmm. John, do you want to go with a few ideas?
Sure. So the biggest story in the higher education beat again this year, I think, will also be enrollment. And all of us have covered the 1.5 million fewer students enrolled in college thing. But it's really important to take this moment to zoom in a little bit on what's really going on. The demographic shift, that is the fluctuations in the birth rate, that's not enough to explain this enormous, unprecedented decline in enrollment. And it isn't the pandemic. This decline in enrollment may have speeded up in the pandemic, but it started 11 years ago. And we're now down 4 million college students in 11 years. But what I think we really need to pay attention to this fall is why high school graduates have stopped going to college, why older learners have stopped going to college. And there's lots of evidence in survey data and focus groups. And what they say is that students and their families have just come to their limit on what they think it's worth for a college education and the degree to which that's providing a return on their investment. There are other sort of nuanced reasons people stopped going to college. It's very complicated and confusing, and an increased proportion of prospective college students are first generation. They don't have college going experience around them. And yet colleges and universities make university admission into a competition and an extraordinarily complicated process to navigate. The sticker price that colleges advertise, almost no one pays it. On average, people pay 54% of that, but students don't know that. And so they don't even bother to apply. A lot of the reasons that people have stopped going to colleges are college's own fault. The constant conversation about whether the Biden administration will forgive student loan debt has had the unintended consequence of reminding students and their parents every single day about the debt that they'll incur if they do, in fact, go on to college. And one of the more mind-boggling things that we found as we've covered this issue is that these kids about to go to college, their parents are still paying off their college loans. So not surprisingly, they're not particularly enthusiastic of encouraging their kids to assume that level of debt. Mm-hmm. You should also look for a continuing decline in international students, especially from China, who are hugely important to universities' bottom lines, but they're drying up according to early visa numbers.
How do you get a sense of enrollment numbers in higher education?
Public universities sometimes report enrollment numbers, and public university systems will report preliminary enrollment numbers fairly early in the fall. And private universities and colleges will probably not tell you their enrollment data, but they have to tell the federal government on October 1st their fall enrollment. This doesn't mean the federal government immediately posts that data, but you know as a beat reporter at that stage that on October 1st, the colleges and universities have the figures. So I would keep that date in mind and put it on your calendar. As another topic, inflation is a really good topic on this beat, because if you think about it, not only does it affect students, but colleges use the stuff that's been going up in price a lot. That is energy, food, and labor, all are increasing in price. Some colleges last year raised their price of food and room and board in the middle of the year because of inflation. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that affects colleges, how that affects college budgets, whether it requires more layoffs and cutbacks during the academic year, and likely will continue to put upward pressure on tuition, which is the worst possible timing at a time when universities and colleges are already struggling to get students.
The enrollment decline, the numbers are unprecedented. What are some of the other story ideas, under this umbrella, John, that you're thinking about covering or you have covered?
Another important way to look at the enrollment decline is what happens as a result of it. What is the impact of having 4 million fewer people with degrees? Or what is the impact of a portion of that number on your community that you cover? On an individual level, it means empirically that they will make on average 67% less in lifetime income. They'll pay less taxes. They'll require more in social services. People without degrees are more obese, are more likely to smoke, so they put more pressure on the healthcare system. They're more likely to get divorced. They're less likely to volunteer or give to charity. All of those things are a drag on the economy. Staying on the same theme as enrollment, it's worth looking at what colleges are doing that keep seats filled. One is that they're working harder to reduce the absolutely awful dropout rate. We lose 1 out of 4 freshmen who don't come back for sophomore year. Another thing they're doing is making it easier to transfer. Typically, a student that goes from a community college to a 4-year university loses from 20% to 25% of the credits that they've already paid for and earned on average. So there are some interesting regional initiatives to make transferring easier in places like New England. Although it's important as journalists that we ask, not only do these credits transfer, but do they transfer into the requirements for a major? Because if they don't, then the transfer agreements don't really help at all. A new idea that's very interesting to improve transfer is dual admission. So not dual enrollment, which means taking college courses while in high school, but dual admission, which means being admitted to both a community college and a 4-year university at the same time, so that you can transfer pretty easily from one to another. So that's an interesting new development, new trend that people might want to check on if their colleges are doing that in their coverage areas. And one final story idea, is that we've all been trying to figure out how to discern whether the Dobbs decision will mean students from blue states stop going to colleges in red states. There have been a lot of polls about this, but the proof is in the numbers. And this is a really hard one to get at. Even if there is a shift in who goes where, it's hard to know the reasons behind it. Plus, red states like Florida and Texas have more enrollment already than they can handle. So it's not as if we're going to see the numbers go down. Mm-hmm. It is worth checking to see if the out-of-state numbers decline at those universities, especially from blue states and largely northern states. And I'd also suggest checking on something that's easier to track, which is whether faculty and staff are leaving universities in red states for blue ones.
Mila, what else are you going to be looking at in the next few months?
I think in the K-12 world, staffing is going to continue to be a huge issue this school year. So many of us will be starting out the year really looking closely at vacancies and what the positions that districts are really struggling to fill. I know here in Chicago, we looked late last year at principals. These past 2-3 years have been really trying for school leaders. They have had to step into roles that traditionally have not been Part of their job description, we've seen principals drive school buses, oversee lunch duty, step in to substitute teach, sometimes for hours a day, every day. And we know how important consistent school leadership is for schools. So I think it's worth taking a look at whether principals in your district are resigning or retiring at a faster pace, which has been very much the case here in Chicago over the past year or so. Something else that I think I will continue to look very closely and try to nail down better for readers is how districts are continuing to spend their federal COVID relief dollars. We know that this past year, some districts, especially high poverty districts with really heightened student needs, were saying that they face some barriers in spending the money. There was hiring difficulties, supply shortages, other reasons why maybe the pace of spending wasn't particularly brisk in some places. So continue to follow how districts are using this money to help students and continue to ask questions about how they know that it's paying off. I always, particularly the last couple of years, I've been really interested in seeing some outcomes from summer school. We've heard a lot from everybody, from local school officials all the way to President Biden, that summer school is a bigger deal than it's been in the past and kind of a key element of helping students recover academically and socially, emotionally from the pandemic. But oftentimes districts can't really tell you how many students attended, how that breaks down by race and income, and how many students actually completed those programs. So I think it's worth asking those questions or requesting that data.
We're talking about beat reporting with two of the top beat reporters in the country. Stay with us for back to school reporting ideas. And you can listen to previous episodes of EWA Radio anytime on your favorite podcast app. We have lots more to chat about with John and Mila after the break. Join the Collaborative for Student Success this summer on the Route K-12 podcast, where they travel the country showcasing the ways federal recovery funds are reshaping our schools. Hosted by Jim Cowan, the Collaborative's executive director, guests will include education commissioners, district superintendents, and other folks who can help figure out where and how the funds are flowing.
Jim will hear from parents about their concerns, share some insights and information that could help improve education where you live, and hopefully have some fun along the way. Look for the Route K-12 Exploring Education Recovery podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts weekly.
I'm Kavitha Cardoza, the host of EWA Radio. This is a busy time for education reporters. It's back to school. I'm joined by Mila Koumpilova with Chalkbeat Chicago and John Marcus with the Hechinger Report. Mila, you've been covering education for how many years now?
On and off for probably about a decade.
And you, John?
I don't remember. That's how long.
So my question is, how do you keep things fresh?
I actually returned to the K-12 education beat here at Chalkbeat literally the week before COVID shut down schools across the country. And a very tiny silver lining of that timing was that the pandemic really upended all of the routines of covering back to school. So obviously, over the past couple of years, the build-up to the first day of school has been really full of news. It's felt really high stakes for students and educators. So some of this sense of this being routine and the scramble to find a fresh approach and a fresh angle has gone away. And I think this fall and the start of school this year is not different.
Mm-hmm. And John, how do you basically not get bored with the beat yourself?
Oh, this beat isn't boring. There's terrific job security in higher education. It never lets you down. On the one hand, very seriously, it's so important. And I think increasingly important. The Hechinger Report was established because a lot of mainstream media were laying off their education writers. I think in the intervening years, people have understood higher education to be a critical subject. And a lot of people do now cover higher education. So it's challenging and interesting to come up with new ways to cover it. And that always keeps you enthusiastic and interested.
I know you had said once, John, that coming up with back to school ideas should not happen in August or September. That's way too late. What did you mean?
Yeah, we're talking about this sort of late in the game. I've learned by hard experience over the years that editors will ask you in August, they'll realize it's time for back to school, and they'll start asking you for stories. And by then, it's just the worst possible time of year to do it. Universities are busy preparing for students to move in, or they're moving in. So we begin to plan our back to school stories in the spring. It does help that a lot of universities hold their freshman orientation early in the summer. So I attended a freshman orientation in July at a university that allowed me to sort of open a story with real students in a real place doing something real. Otherwise, campuses in general are empty in the summer. So we tend to do these stories and kind of stockpile or inventory them early in the summer and have them available for publication in August when people are thinking about back to school.
I have to agree with John that getting a head start on planning back to school coverage and really your entire coverage earlier in the summer or even in the spring is enormously helpful. I think it's especially important or helpful when it comes to those longer term projects that you're planning to do during the school year. But I will also say that every summer seems to fly by, and there's always more news than I anticipate. So I always find myself in the weeks leading up to the school year scrambling to do some of that planning and some of that legwork. And sometimes it does stretch into the beginning of the school year. And oftentimes things still work out okay. So if you didn't do what John and I recommend, don't despair. I think it's not too late, and you can still set yourself up for strong back to school coverage and for strong enterprise throughout the school year.
We've talked a lot about serious issues, and there are a lot in education reporting. What are both of you doing to cover joy?
I agree. There's been so much grim and really serious education news during the pandemic. And obviously, we need to really maintain that sense of urgency and that focus on how the pandemic has dramatically widened disparities in education by race, income, disability, and so on. So we have to stay serious, but I do think there's a lot of hunger out there from readers for stories that bring back that joy. We had hugely popular stories last spring about kids getting to do normal prom again. We have a feature that we've been doing for a couple years now about hearing from valedictorians from campuses across the city, which folks love. I think anytime you can figure out a way to get into a classroom and see learning happening, I think you end up capturing some of that joy. So those stories are out there. And I think it's important going into the school year to have this mindset of looking for them and wanting to tell them without feeling that you're being frivolous or ignoring the very serious issues of the day.
Mm-hmm. And John?
Well, I like your word joy, but I think I'm going to offer two different words. One is hope and one is inspiration. And I see that often when I cover higher education. I see really driven students who make me feel like an underachiever when they tell me what they've accomplished even before they've started college. And so joy, I'm not sure how much joy there is on campus these days. There are some solutions, there is some innovation, not enough, but there's certainly inspiration and there's certainly hope.
And that wraps up this episode of EWA Radio. I'm Kavita Cardoza. Thanks for being with us. Thank you to Mila Koumpilova with Chalkbeat Chicago and John Marcus with the Hechinger Report. Please share your back-to-school story ideas with us on Twitter @EdWriters.
This week's episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by the Collaborative for Student Success.